Welcome. Thank you for coming in today and hope lunch was enjoyable for you. Seems to be some more food, so grab some on your way out. I'm Rob Walker. I'm the executive director of the Aspen Institute's Homeland Security Program. And for all of you new faces out there, we welcome you here. We're here today to talk about the importance of international partnerships in securing our nation's borders and ensuring our homeland security. Leading that conversation for us today will be a former Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, and I'll turn it over to him now for introductions of the panel.
Great. Well, we're delighted to be here and delighted to talk about a very important topic. And let me briefly introduce to my right Ambassador Gutierrez from Mexico
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
and Commissioner McAleenan, who is the head of Customs and Border Protection. As many of you know, we were going to have a couple of other uh, officials from Latin America up here, but they were called back and are unable to participate. But I think we'll have a good representation here. What I was going to do is ask the commissioner first to say maybe a few words for a few minutes, and then the ambassador, and then we'll have a discussion among the three of us, and then leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Again, requesting that the questions be on topic. And with that, Commissioner, let me open it up to you.
Sure. Good morning, and actually look forward to the conversation today very much. It's a privilege to be with you again, Secretary Chertoff, and obviously my close colleague, Ambassador Gutierrez, who I would say is one of the finest diplomats, certainly in the hemisphere, if not the world. And it's been a true honor to work with him in the past several years in a period that's been, I think, tremendously productive in terms of partnership with Mexico, and both U.S. and Mexico partnering with the region on a set of shared challenges and threats. And any conversation on that set of shared challenges and threats really has to focus on transnational criminal organizations and their diversified businesses, which unfortunately are moving narcotics, which are harming our communities and having tremendous impact both on producing in transit nations and on moving people, smuggling people at very high profit levels from not only within this region, but outside the hemisphere up to our border. Both of those present significant challenges to law enforcement and to managing a shared border where the primary focus should be facilitating that lawful trade and travel that's so critical to our economies. Very happy to see continued progress and looking forward to the implementation of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement on trade going forward. We've seen a 10% increase in trade across our U.S. ports of entry on the southwest border, 20% more trucks this year, and that continued partnership will just enable us to foster that further. And we look forward, I think, in this conversation today and talking about some of the approaches we've taken jointly to both facilitate and secure lawful trade and travel, as well as addressing those security threats in the region. And I do have to mention in any conversation that our shared partnership to make sure that security threats do not gain a foothold in our hemisphere, and certainly in our North American partnership is essential as well. And Mexico's done a tremendous amount of work in that area. But we are worried about flows from conflict regions arriving in South America and making their way up to our border in the hands of these same smuggling organizations that are moving narcotics and people throughout the region. So we've got a lot to talk about, a lot to continue to work on together, and we look for continuity in our partnership with Mexico to address these threats.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a privilege to be here, and I thank the Aspen Institute for the invitation. And it's also a privilege to be with Secretary Chertoff and Commissioner McAleenan. The United States, Mexico, and Canada just recently took a very important step for the region with arriving to a new trade agreement. That is something very positive, and it sets the base to address other very important issues, essentially security, our shared security concerns. If I'm asked today, what is the status of U.S.-Mexico cooperation on security, I would say that it's never been better. And some people might rightly be skeptical about that assertion. If it's never been better, why doesn't it look as good as you're saying, right? So I think first we must stay the course and understand that we cannot fully address our shared security concerns unless we continue with our cooperation. And I think there are two or three things, four maybe, that are crucial in order to improve that cooperation. One of them has to do with, what are our assets? What is it that we have built, say, over the last 10 to 15 years between the United States and Mexico in terms of security cooperation? First, I think to a large extent, we have we now, as a general rule, avoid finger pointing between ourselves. Most of us, on most occasions, have understand that this is, as it's often said, a truly shared responsibility issue. That's something very positive, because we only waste time if we're pointing fingers. Two, we have established a level of trust, but both at the strategic and at the operation level, that it is unprecedented. Three, we have coordinated actions and policies as never before. Some of that is naturally not advertised and not publicized, and there are good reasons for that. But there is much more in terms of security cooperation that catches, the eye of public opinion. And I think that we've grown closer to building a shared assessment of what are the true security concerns that we face. Any security strategy implies three things. Implies identifying what the risks are. And by and large, I think there we have the same view about what the risks are. It's natural, given the international stance of the United States, that the United States has other external threats and security challenges that we don't have. But the common denominator between us, it's pretty clear, and there is a fairly close to an agreement on what that is. Then the second part of any strategy is you need to assign resources to that, to addressing those threats and those risks. And whether it's through the Iniciativa Mérida or other coordinated bilateral efforts, that is precisely what we do. And in the end, which is the third component, you need to, again, identify the risks, assigning them a probability that they will materialize, and then using the resources to address those. In a nutshell, that's what we do together. What are the problems? Why do we see, if you look at some of the metrics, why don't we, it wouldn't be as obvious that we're doing such a fine job? Part, in all truth, I think it has to do with what is going on in Mexico. 10 years ago, we decided, or 15 years ago, we decided to completely head on to international drug trafficking organizations that operated in Mexico at a huge cost for Mexico in terms of treasure and in terms of blood. And that has created the metastasize of drug cartels, and they have extended themselves to other illegal activities, and therefore they have made the problem much more complex. So certainly there's challenges within Mexico. We need to continue building our institutional capacities to address this, and that implies resources. In the future, as you know, there will be a, so that's part of what we need to do, and there's some things that need to be done in Mexico. Very briefly, again, going to the cooperation, we just, in a sense, I think that there's two things that we should consider. The way our governments work is really agency to agency, and that's fine, but most of the threats require an interagency approach. If you multiply that by both governments, then it makes it much more complex. We need, I think, in the future to focus on, once we have those threats clear, having interagency groups that work together with the appropriate legal funding to address those threats. Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, and you name it. it is only through an interagency approach and a more coordinated effort that I think we will be able to be even more successful.
Well, so let me begin first by asking you each to talk a little bit about the security threats in the region. And I think they essentially fall in three buckets. One is drug trafficking, and it's not just what people used to think about as cocaine, but there's fentanyl, there's a whole lot of other cross-border activity, both that has impact in Mexico and in the US. Second, human trafficking. And then third, security issues arising from concerns about terrorism. And I know people tend to think about this in terms of ISIS and foreign fighters, but let's remember as well that Hezbollah has been a presence in the hemisphere for quite some time. And my recollection is that Venezuela has pretty direct air connections with Iran. And so that raises a set of issues about that. So with those buckets, if I could ask first the commissioner, then the ambassador to give us your sense of where we stand vis-a-vis these security issues, and what you see as the strategic approach we need to take to them.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the third one a little bit, because I think the regional partnership that we've developed with Mexico and helping lead and partner with other governments in the region has been absolutely essential. So a couple of important kind of global consensus areas here. UN Security Council resolutions 2178 and 2396 were very important statements over the past 2 years that we need to do better at building individual nation capacity to understand threats that are moving in commercial traffic around the world. Whether it's sharing biographic information, terrorist watch list information, collecting biometrics in a way that can enhance security, that these are important things that should be developed. And I would offer that our hemisphere is actually ahead of Europe and other regions in being able to have this capacity to identify threats entering the region and to address it effectively with shared information. To give you an example, every year we stop about 3,000 known suspected terrorists from traveling to the United States. It might be more surprising to realize, though, that we have a similar number that are attempting to move through the region and arrive via air from Europe, from the Middle East, direct to South America, to the Caribbean, and to Panama. So being able to collaborate on identifying those threats and take shared operational action, whether it's investigative, whether it's addressing finances, whether it's looking at what materials moving through, is absolutely essential. And I think having over 24 partners working on this together in the region between the U.S. and Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and now South America has been essential to giving us a sense of what's happening in the region, being able to take collective action. Because there are threats, Secretary, as you alluded to, including the historical Hezbollah presence in Venezuela, but also just a lot of movement of multiple terrorist actors through the region.
Mr. Ambassador, what do you see in terms of these buckets of threats?
Well, following up on terrorism, I think that the first comment I would make is that few countries would be as impacted by Mexico, as impacted as Mexico, if another terrorist attack takes place in the United States. You were there right after 9/11, Mr. Secretary. And at that time, people in Mexico were not so conscious about whether Mexico played a role in this or not. Nowadays, and it's just to be sure, to the question, can a terrorist use Mexico to harm the United States? Yes, it can. And that is precisely why we act upon that. Has it happened? No, it has not happened. Not a single story, some of them have been in the press, has been verified. Are there been cases in which our joint cooperation has been able to stop that? Yes, they have. As Commissioner McLean was saying on terrorism, we have a fairly good exchange of information of passengers, containers, and people that allow us to identify any potential threat to Mexico, to the United States, and to our region. And I think that so far we have been successful. Our intelligence services exchange frequent information with the United States Intelligence Service at different levels, with the specifics, specifically with regard to any terrorist threat. On I'll refer to human trafficking. That's a problem. Human trafficking is perhaps, it's a challenge way up there in terms of priority. It generates a lot of money for international crime organizations. And even though we, throughout the years, have established programs to do two things, arrest these people and prosecute them, we have not, I think, been as successful. Part of the problem, I think, is we need to improve our legal framework to be able to be more successful to process ones that people are, you know, have been arrested or are detained because of human trafficking. And we also need to improve there a little bit our intelligence. On a daily basis, however, you will see that there's a series of exchanges of information through different authorities throughout the border to try to address human trafficking. We're not where we need to be, certainly, but I think that, again, it's an issue of, in my view, of staying the course and adjusting what needs to be adjusted. On the drug trafficking issue, which it's a much larger topic, I think that we share the view that the major threats right now are coming from heroin and from synthetic drugs. In the case of fentanyl, it is extremely difficult to address and to identify. That is why we're working on technology in the border, because that's the only way we can do it. And for example, through cooperation in our ports. Some of the fentanyl comes through Mexico, also arrives directly to the United States, and the sort of problems that are encountered even by mail. So the sort of problems that are encountered by the United States are very similar as those are encountered by Mexico to identify fentanyl and address that issue. On heroin, it's mainly cultivated in two areas in Mexico, in the Golden Triangle of North and in Guerrero. In Guerrero, it's a very complicated situation because it's entangled with social problems in the region. We are doing, I think, a wonderful job, and you see here several of our personnel from the Army that are really responsible for a magnificent eradication effort, but that's not enough. We are doing significant efforts in eradication.
So we don't have some of the panelists from South America here, but if we turn to the issue of human trafficking, I'm sorry.
I'm just going to add 3 points on the drug situation that I think are important, and because if you look at the media, it's opioids, it's synthetic opioids, fentanyl, but if you talk to state and local law enforcement, they're talking about methamphetamine. It doesn't have the same overdose impact, but we've seen a 10-fold increase in seizures of meth at our border in the last 6 years. It's being manufactured by cartels in Mexico and brought up primarily through our ports of entry. The second piece is really the significant increase in production of cocaine in Colombia and in the Andes. After the peace deal, we've seen it 5 or 6-fold increases. A lot of that's going to Europe and to Australia and New Zealand, unfortunately, but some of that's increase is coming to us. We're having record interdiction in the source and transit zone. Our Coast Guard partners on the water, aided by CBP Maritime Patrol aircraft, but that's also making the flow through Central America and Mexico and having this destabilizing impact and creating additional profit centers. I guess the one area that's changed in the positive direction in terms of smuggling volume is marijuana. It used to be the core cash crop for the cartels. It isn't anymore. We've seen almost a 50% reduction in marijuana being smuggled across the border. Obviously, there are legal options in the U.S. now, but that's. I think it's important to understand the changing dynamics so that we can address it together regionally, because that extends all the way down into the Andes.
Well, and so with the human trafficking piece, obviously, people are reading about the caravan coming up, and there have been caravans in the past. They are coming from someplace, and trying to stop people at the border is tough. It's a little bit like being the hockey goalie with nobody else on the ice and just getting pucks shot at you. So the question is, what can be done in the sending countries as part of a strategy to actually reduce the pressure that is turning people to the smugglers?
Sure. I think that's got to be a key part of our strategy, and it certainly is a key part of U.S. strategy. I want to make one quick differentiation because I think actually it's the same term in Spanish. But for us, we do have a pretty distinct line between human smuggling, which could be economic migrants being smuggled by the same criminal organizations, charged $5,000 to $8,000 for the journey, still exploited, still extorted, but they're in a process of arriving somewhere, versus human trafficking, where criminals are taking them and exploiting them upon arrival. It's a smaller but even more concerning aspect of this phenomenon. But on the human smuggling and the migration flows, I mean, you have to have a multi-pronged strategy. You have to address the push factors in the sending countries, and they're primarily economic. They're economic opportunity, poverty, hunger. We've seen that in the areas of Guatemala, where we've had a big increase, for instance, in migration being smuggled into the United States. We have an alliance for prosperity between the Northern Triangle countries that the U.S. and Mexico are jointly supporting. We just had the presidents of Honduras and Guatemala, the vice president of El Salvador here last week, committed to addressing these challenges on every front, from the business environment on the one hand, and enhancing our customs partnerships, to addressing the smugglers, working on issues of security in the major metropolitan areas. The U.S. has a lot to bring to bear in that, and CBP, from a border security, a customs capacity, and kind of highlighting the issues that are driving people to leave, we need to address that. And then we have to partner in transit. We have to have a good alignment of our strategy with Mexico. I mean, it might not be well understood, but crossings of our border from Mexico are less than 50% now in 5 of the last 6 years. The Mexican economy's growth and development has changed that dynamic. The migration is flowing from further away to the United States. So I think that's a key aspect of it. Unfortunately, TCOs in Mexico have taken up that opportunity and are profiting to the tune of $2.5 billion on the flow.
Yes, Mr. Mazzia.
In the year 2000, Mr. Secretary, there were 1.6 million apprehensions on the United States southern border. 1.6 million. 97% of them were Mexican nationals, if I'm not mistaken. We forget that we were at those numbers not too far away. It's positive that those numbers in general have been reduced significantly to what, less than around 300,000 apprehensions? No? So first we need to account, you mentioned earlier about the importance of working on reliable data. And out of that number, around 100 to 20,000 to 150,000 come from Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. Why is that? Precisely because of what the commissioners say. Mexico has done its work fairly well, at least, and it certainly has to do also with enforcement, that's natural. But an important part is that people are now finding better opportunities in Mexico. And that's the only way. It's either demographics, long-term demographics that will order this, or it needs to be developed. As the commissioner said just last week, we had the Central American countries. This is the first time that Mexico and the United States have clearly and openly worked together to address this with the Central Americans. The challenge is huge. The lack of institutional capacity in these countries is significant in many cases, and also poverty and insecurity levels. And I say this with the utmost respect, it's just simply what it is. We need to address development and the push factors. My own view is that you needed to address it in 3 tracks. One is through infrastructure investments that take long time or difficult projects, and that's really medium to long term. You need to address conditions to establish a minimum level of social development, especially in those areas more prone to immigration. And then we need to work together with our good Americans from Central America in addressing institutional capacity. If Mexico has challenge in institutional capacity, and we do, just imagine with our Central American friends. Thankfully, there is increasing conscious about that. And if I may say so, with all due respect also, in the future part of the equation, there's going to be mobility in the region. And it's important that all of the countries have work to the best of their abilities and capacities to make sure that there are, that we improve the legal avenues available for people to move around. I often say, half jokingly and half not, when talking about Mexicans, that Mexicans don't have a chip implanted here saying, I want to break the law and get into the United States. That shows him, if people are offered a legal avenue, I think by and large they will use it. And there are legal avenues. I mention this because one of the important points that we have begun to work is just simply awareness and campaigns. The CBP has started a campaign in coordination with us and the Central Americans, just simply to let know people that it's not okay just simply to go through the borders without the appropriate documentation. That is very important, because if we send the wrong signals, Mexico does, and this is not about being unobservant of human rights or being insensitive to the fact. I don't think that's the case, and that's not certainly the idea that I get from the United States. It's just that if we need to be clear about what is possible and not.
So it sounds to me that, strategically, again, looking at this as a system, end to end, that from a cost effectiveness standpoint, working in the sending countries to do three things: build up economic opportunity, second, help with agriculture, because people, if they can't eat, they're gonna run, and third, rule of law and security. If those could be addressed in the sending countries, that wouldn't eliminate some of this, but it would really reduce it. If you can give me, first Mr. Ambassador and then Commissioner, your wish list for the kinds of concrete things we could do and where we might do them that would begin to make those appropriate investments in the sending countries?
Well, I think that on rule of law dash law enforcement, we need to work closer with our Central American friends, as we're doing, or really beginning to do, to beef up capacity on law enforcement and rule of law there in many ways. Courts, police, immigration authorities. And I think that the resources that are put forward by the United States through the INL are very useful. They are always complemented with resources from the receiving countries. I think that's the right approach. I'm not saying that it's perfect, and we can certainly have improvements there, but it's not only the money, it's the fact that that builds trust among the regional partners, and it builds long-term nationalized capacity. So that just simply must continue. The other thing is that the United States did put forward the Alliance for Prosperity in recent years, mainly as a result of the 2014-15 what was called a family crisis at the border. That is just a few years ago, and it's probably only beginning to do a dent. I don't have a good sense whether I would assume that probably more resources are needed. I think that Mexico must complement that effort with whatever resources we have available, and certainly the receiving countries. That formula works. But again, there's two tracks. One is, I'll give you the example. If there's gas and electricity there, then there's the possibility of bringing, if you don't have those two, if you don't have highways and ports, then it's difficult to bring private investment. And neither the United States government nor the Mexican government nor any other for that part probably has enough resources just to put money and pay for everything. So we need to find ways in which the governments can help attract private investment into these countries. And I think that's the strategy that we're finishing to put together, to provide those long-term infrastructure projects or big projects, and at the same time, address very basic health and social needs in those regions. Those are the two tracks, I think, and my wish list actually has to do less with the objective, because I think it's perfectly clear. I think we need consistency, and we need to have a systematic effort that transcends administrations in the United States and in Mexico in order to really have an impact in a few years. Because what happens if you begin to change things every so often, because our government change or your government change or a government in Central America change, then that doesn't help.
Commissioner,
I agree with everything the ambassador said. I mean, I think we need to have a very comprehensive understanding of the push factors in a nuanced and specific way. There are no generalizations that apply to all three Northern Triangle countries or every region of the three countries. You have to have a much more specific and nuanced approach. But the one salient point really across all three is economic opportunity and poverty. And the ambassador just highlighted two of the keys to addressing that. Whether you're talking to business groups, civil society organizations, the governments themselves, the rule of law piece comes up as a consistent issue that they want to extend and improve upon and need to in all three countries to foster that business environment. One specific area that CBP is tackling in partnership with the SOT, the Customs Administration in Mexico, as well as the three countries, are how do we take advantage of their decision to make a customs union and really empower the customs organizations of the three Northern Triangle countries to work together to really change that dynamic for cross-border movement of goods within Central America and then beyond to their export partners. That's something that we think we have a real opportunity with the customs reforms in Honduras, the customs strategy in Guatemala, and the new commitment from El Salvador to join that in earnest, to really change their dynamic of how goods move. And that's something we want to support. The other side of this is where there are issues of security and violence that are contributing to migration. We want to support addressing that in terms of diminishing the power of the gangs in these communities. El Salvador has developed a plan, El Salvador Seguro, which is very comprehensive. It takes the law enforcement pieces of community policing, if you will, and combines it with investments in education and vocational training and cultural opportunities that have really made an impact in 50 municipalities in El Salvador. And another stat that people might not realize is migration from El Salvador is down 40% this year. It's working if you can create safety, if you can create economic opportunity and jobs. And that's going to be the main challenge that we face in the region is reducing the gap between young people entering the workforce and the jobs that are available, which is just immense. In Guatemala, the average age is 19. There's 150,000 people entering the workforce every year. There's about 30,000 jobs available. Got to change that dynamic, or we won't be able to keep people in a safe opportunity in their home country. So that's where I think we need to focus our efforts.
and that's actually a global issue now. That the rising tide of young folks in all parts of the world, and if they don't get employment, that creates kind of a fertile ground for some bad activity. So one thing that emerges from this, what I'd like you both to comment on briefly, is the smuggling organizations are marketing themselves. And as with any other system where you're trying to get people to sign up to do something, information becomes part of the battlefield. Can you give us a sense of what the smuggling organizations try to propagate in order to lure people into their pipeline? And some thought about how we might correct the record on those things. Commissioner?
Sure. We're losing the information battle with the smuggling organizations very, very clearly. Their marketing is more sophisticated. They take it to the retail level. They're on social media in a way and more comprehensively and more persuasively than we are in explaining how the law actually works and what the results of a migration attempt would be. I met a 17-year-old indigenous leader in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, who said, no, it's very clear the smugglers in my community just say, if you bring a child with you, you'll get immediate residency in the United States. Well, of course that's not true, but it will start a legal process that can take 5 to 7 years and will allow someone to stay in the U.S. So how do we get the actual messages there? What we talked about with our partners in the region is giving them the facts of how our immigration system works, what the legal possibilities are, and let them put it into their words and address that on an individualized basis in schools, in communities, because government advertising writ large is not proven very effective when you're combating a very persuasive story from a smuggler or a family member who's been successful. That's the other aspect of it that we have to be candid about and recognize.
I would just add that Not too long ago, and maybe still in some ways, smugglers were considered heroes in their communities, um, literally heroes. That is beginning to change, but it'll still take more, precisely to communicate what what the commissioner has just said. It's an issue of information campaigns at every level. I personally think that it's imperative that those campaigns are done jointly, not only coordinated but jointly, because they send a signal. If the United States, the Central American countries, Mexico, and are exactly on the same page in terms of the message, then people are probably going to think a little bit more, at least before they decide to embark in such a dangerous journey. So that is certainly one of the things. And the other is we need to have, it's important, people don't know that we have, different security agencies are present in Mexico in observance of our legal framework. We need to have people working side by side more on these issues. And we do, but even more so, in order to really be able to make a difference. Um, I'm pleased that at local level, for example, CBP is working with the state of Tamaulipas in this regard. And we have people at the National Targeting Center looking at all types of. But it's only really after you have people sitting side by side on a permanent basis that you begin to see exactly the same things and design the strategies that are needed. Um, just to, I'm sure you all see, and I'll touch briefly on the last caravan. It's a perfect example. There are people that are being tricked. It is very much, according to the evidence that we see, politically motivated also. There are organizations, very well organizations, that have bosses and perfectly organized a route. And this time around, we're sending a stronger signal. There is a humanitarian crisis going on, and we need to call it what it is. And I hope that we do so soon, because if not, we will continue to send the wrong signal.
Well, on that note, we have a little bit of time for questions. If you would raise your hand and identify, where you're from or your affiliation, and not speeches, but questions. Ambassador Bernstein.
Stuart Bernstein, former ambassador to Denmark, American ambassador to Denmark. Can you give us Mexico's point of view on the so-called wall? Do we need a physical wall? And what else? I mean, we hear our president tell us that we need the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. I'd love to hear your point of view.
Quite clearly, I would beg to differ from the president's view. Mexico understands and respects the right of the United States as any country to enforce its laws and protect its borders. And in the end, so long as it's observant of international law, it's a sovereign decision of the United States. We have that very clear. Point number two, if you ask us, as your friendly neighbor, no, we don't think it's the best idea, nor necessarily it will be the best use of resources, but that's something for the United States to debate internally. I think that if one takes a closer look at what we can do together in the border, there are many alternatives, and I just would say that those deserve to be reviewed to the extent possible. And on the question of whether we're going to pay, that's the easiest one. Simply, the answer is no, with all due respect. That will never happen.
One thing which I think people may not necessarily understand is the degree to which there's tactical cooperation on both sides of the border, which you may just want to mention just for a moment.
Absolutely. So we have partnerships with Mexican agencies across the board in different regions, from South Texas to Baja California and the San Diego border, where we operate joint patrols, where we try to ensure that we're keeping each other informed on routes or just situations of violence that are popping up that we can address together. And it's actually much more effective than trying to do this unilaterally on one side of the border. Patrolling jointly has decreased activity in key areas and increased safety dramatically.
One of the key things that, with the support of CBP and our security agencies in Mexico, that seems to be taken as very good, is dividing into corridors the whole border, identify jointly what we see going on both sides, what are the specific threats to that corridor, and then working, again, interagency on those corridors to address everything illegal going northbound and southbound. That's probably the right approach. Again, it has to do not necessarily working agency to agency, but being more strategic. I think that's something that it seems to be working and should continue.
All right, Meryl? Just so you know, Meryl's a ringer. We're married.
Yeah, Meryl Chertoff, Director of the Justice and Society Program at the Aspen Institute. We can judge our commitment to various aspects of this by the resources committed. And the Alliance for Prosperity, the theory behind it is to reduce the push factors. In fiscal year 2016, the allocation for Alliance for Prosperity was $750 million. In the FY 2018 budget, the administration asked for $460 million, a significant diminution. At the same time, we have a significant increase in the amount of resources that the administration has requested for border enforcement. Do you think that that's the proper allocation of resources?
If you're asking me, I think we need to invest in both. $2.6 billion in the last 4 years for the Alliance for Prosperity for the Central American strategy, and that's a bipartisan commitment on the Hill. It's administration policy. We want to see that continue and continue to work because we are seeing signs of impact. That said, we also do need to invest in our border security, and it does, from our perspective, from the Border Patrol agents on the ground, include investments in wall system, not for the whole border, but in areas where we have population centers on both sides of the border, where we have high traffic, where we have challenges controlling those areas, but more importantly, technology, personnel, our ports of entry to facilitate the lawful trade and travel and staff it effectively so that we can interdict narcotics and other threats. We got to have a balanced investment. You can't just focus on any one problem of the cycle, as the Secretary is alluding to. You have to address push factors. Got to partner with Mexico on transit. We have to invest in border security, and we have to have good law and policy behind us.
One good news, Mr. Secretary and Commissioner, is on the part of the United States, I think has to do with the fact that there was recently a modification to OPIC's, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, scope and capacity.
Doubled.
No country, nor even the United States, have enough money just to throw around, if you might use that expression. In the end, you need, again, to complement private resources with public resources. I happen to be, before this life, a banker. And one of the things that I learned is that the most difficult part is actually structuring appropriate the projects. If there are good projects, it's not so difficult to find the money, with lending in term condition and a mix of concessional resources, loans, and cooperation. It's really getting those projects appropriately structured and well planned that will do the trick. But I want to salute that decision taking to increase the capacity of OPIC, because I think that's something that the United States can really use as a tool to bring that development, and that it does not imply necessarily the use of budget resources on a yearly basis.
That's very true. Yes, back there.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Michaela Ross. I'm with Bloomberg Government. I appreciate the conversation we've had about human smuggling. I just wanted to address specifically the comments from President Trump this morning about the caravan, reports of about 4,000 people at this point that's coming towards the U.S. And he had tweeted this morning about asking Mexico to, quote unquote, stop the onslaught. I'm wondering what your response would be to this call. And I'm also wondering what that impact of actually closing the southern border with military would be, both economically and security-wise.
Mr. Ambassador?
We take people, the last 2 years, as it's obvious, there have been 2 difficult years. I started my conversation with the fact that we were able to get to a trade agreement. People would have not bet their own money 18 months ago that the United States, Mexico, and Canada were actually going to update NAFTA and get to where we are, and we did it. And that's just, in my view, an example that if we're serious, even if we have differences, if we talk to each other clearly, we can accomplish a lot of things. We will solve the issue of the migration phenomenon in the same way, in my view. Specifically with the caravan, you will learn about a decision taken by the Mexican government, if not now, probably within the next hour. It will be a smart decision, in my view, to address this issue. Quite clearly, the Mexican government does not promote or condone irregular immigration and does not advocate for anybody to enter the United States irregularly. That's not what we do, and that's not what we want. We do have a humanitarian crisis. And on our own side, we need to address better. We need to be more serious about enforcing our own immigration laws. But at the same time, we cannot just simply close our eyes to the humanitarian factor. That is precisely what we're going to do. I do hope we're, and quite clearly being, candid with you, we cannot have another caravan that's going to go through Mexico and is going to be advertising Fox News during the next week, so things are going to be very bad. We're working on it. We'll find the right solution, and we'll find it in a way that it's, it's convenient, it's intelligent, and that, it serves the good interests of the Central American countries, Mexico, and also the United States.
I think one important takeaway from the discussion we've had here is that actually putting aside what is sometimes in the media and the kind of dramatization of conflict, in reality, the operational cooperation at every level between the U.S. and Mexico, and frankly, the U.S. and Mexico and most of the countries in the hemisphere is really excellent. Venezuela maybe is an outlier, but at the work level, where things actually get done, things are really, there's a lot of trust and a lot of cooperation.
Yes.
I think we have time for one more question.
Could I just add to
sure.
that point, Mr. Secretary, because I think that's very important, and the ambassador alluded to it in his opening. The last 18 months, the operational collaboration, I think, has just deepened, but we've also made it strategic and structural. We now have a unified cargo processing program that we're doing jointly at our border, 9 ports of entry. This is U.S. Customs Border Protection, Mexican Customs, Mexican Agriculture, Senacica, all together processing cargo coming into the U.S. It's reduced wait times and enhanced security across the board. We have strategic engagements with federal police, with CSEN, with Mexican military elements that are involved in security on the civil side, all at a much higher level than we had 2 years ago. And we're continuing to build on that collaboration and look forward to continuity. So I think that's a really important point at the operational level. Things are going tremendously well.
Okay, time for one more question. Yeah, over there.
Abel Nunez with the Central American Resource Center, a community-based organization here in the district. My question is about what happens to the immigrants that continue to come. You agreed that there's a humanitarian crisis and that the actual solution is a long-term, so economic development and strengthening democratic institutions in the country of origin, particularly the Northern Triangle, will take years to happen. What do we do then with the inflow that are fleeing if we're limiting the ability for people to then legally, without having open border policies, and that's not what I'm advocating, but we're also canceling TPS, which will put incredible pressure. So what does that mean for both Mexico to open up its border to receive immigrants as well as the US? And does that undermine security, what you're trying to do with security?
Well, I want to emphasize something. I mean, I think it's appropriate to distinguish that migration flows are not in itself a security threat. We do, I think, a fine work in trying to identify within any type of migration flow, including those irregular, who's a threat and who is not. By and large, what we know and what evidence show is that these are good, hardworking, principled people that are just trying to find a better opportunity for them and their families. And I think that we should start there. But we cannot advocate for just open borders. That simply won't work, and that's not appropriate. Mexico, on our side, again, going to a wish list, what I dare to advocate for our own selves is we need to increase our capacity to receive refugees from Central America. Our own Commission on Refugees has minimal capacity at this point, and we need to do that. If somebody's fleeing for their lives from Central America, it's natural that Mexico should offer them as the first point asylum. We cannot, honestly, we have limited capacity. We will have to work with the United States and other countries to those people that are truly in compliance with, have a legitimate claim of refugee or asylum, help them out. And everybody needs to support that effort. Some people that do not want, also there's a good evidence that part of these people are not in itself, don't have a legitimate asylum claim, but it's rather a economic migration. On our side, and I can only speak on our side, we do have temporary worker programs in Mexico for Central Americans. We need to take a closer look at that and increase those capacities, because whatever flows take place, it's better that they're orderly and legal. And if I may say so, I think the United States should also take a look at what are the avenues available, so people can use the legal avenues. And that's something that it's in the end the solution, addressing the push factors, and having legal avenues. That's the only way to go.
I would echo the ambassador. We have to have the appropriate approach, security, law, and policy, to address the different populations that are crossing the border. We have three distinct groups. We have adults who are trying to evade capture, which includes, unfortunately, hardened smugglers bringing narcotics, and about 20,000 criminals a year. That's the first group. We want to have the ability to detect and interdict them from entering the country. The second group, which is a big group now, is families and kids and adults that are seeking to claim asylum, but really might be representing more of an economic migration. And then within that group, we have about 10 to 15% who claim asylum at the end of the process are actually found to warrant asylum and protections in the United States. We're having a lot of difficulty getting to that group, processing their claims quickly and effectively, so they can be protected and safe and have a future in the United States, because we have these other two groups that we're dealing with. What people might not realize is we are right now more effective at interdicting people crossing illegally than we've ever been before, based on continued investments in technology and wall system and personnel. But what's happening with that second group, the kids and families and the folks claiming asylum, they're actually presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents. They're not even trying to evade capture. So very clearly, our legal framework needs to be able to address them more effectively and expeditiously. And we've asked Congress to address that challenge, because we do want to be able to be nimble enough to handle the humanitarian crisis and tackle TCOs and address the security requirements we have at the same time.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I think the one takeaway really at a high level is this is really a matter of strategically looking at end-to-end at the whole system. People single out one part of it, but in the end, if you don't look at the push factors, the pull factors, if you don't separate the different motivations and the different interests at stake, you wind up only kind of moving the problem around on the plate. You have to really look at all of it in order to solve it. And I'm sure this is going to be a top of mind conversation. But thank you for both of you for coming here to talk about this.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. We welcome you to stick around for a little while, enjoy the refreshments we still have, and look forward to engaging with you on discussions of partnership. Thank you.